Welcome to the first in our Luke study series. My presenter for all 3 weeks is Dr. Melody Briggs. The series is part of the Darlington District Worship Academy.
Melody has been a theological educator for more than 20 years, and the author of a number of books, in particular a booklet interpreting Bible stories for children and young teens, which I think gives an indication of the area of interests that Melody has. But perhaps particular of interest to us this evening, she's also written a book called How Children Read Biblical Narrative, which is an investigation of children's readings of the Gospel of Luke. And this is, I think, what Melody will be helping us to understand. A reading of Luke's Gospel. So I'm going to hand over to Melody now. Thank you, Melody.
And thank you, Chris. And hello to everyone. And I'm really delighted to be with you. I'm going to try to work out where to put my laptop so that I'm neither too large nor too small. Poor Susan Thorne is not managing to get in. I've admitted her like 3 times now. So welcome. I'm assuming I'm making several assumptions here. One is that you have some familiarity with the Gospel of Luke. That's assumption 1. I did ask for Christopher and Bill to pass on the message that to get all of you to read it in advance. I don't know if all of you have managed that or not. We'll worry about that in a bit. I'm making assumptions that you are going to be using this in some capacity in the coming months in Lent, for the lectionary, January through March or whatever it may be. So we're going to do big picture stuff, and then we're going to do nitty-gritty stuff to try to help you think that through. Is that okay? So there'll be things I'm not going to talk about because I'm going to be thinking more along the lines of how do we use this rather than talking about certain other things. So I've tried to tailor this a little bit towards you, but Chris and Bill are also going to be doing how to preach it, I think. Is that what you're calling it? The preaching approach to the gospel, which I'm not going to do. I'm going to have to work on familiarity and how it works, and they're going to work on the practical theology side of it. Is everyone happy with that? Everyone know what you're getting yourselves into? There are 3 sessions to this. Tonight's session is big picture stuff, overall gospel. The next 2 sessions will be looking at specific aspects of reading Luke, depending the first one on how Luke communicates to us, and the second one on different elements of Luke as a narrative. And they'll be looking at specific sections of Luke, whereas tonight we're doing mostly doing big picture. There'll be certain sections we will look at, but in order to inform the big picture. Everyone happy? Everyone's sitting comfortably? Okay, if you're happy then, I'm going to pray and we'll begin. We give you thanks, Lord, for tonight and for being together, and pray for your Holy Spirit to guide our time. Help us to be open to you and to your guidance, and to hear from you through your word, we pray. Amen. Amen. Okay, I'm going to share screen. And yeah, there we go. And I'm using a PowerPoint to work us through the session. I will at times take the PowerPoint down so we can chat with each other, and other times leave it up. And when you go in breakout rooms, you probably want to kind of memorize the questions you're going to go into. So as I said, this is session 1. And in this session 1, we're focusing on the big picture of Luke, the big story, as it were. My aims in this session are to give you help to get an overview of the Gospel of Luke, to help you become familiar with the overall structures. It's all big picture stuff. To consider the overall story that Luke tells, and to consider what Luke reveals or shows about Jesus. Again, big picture. These are all in terms of the big picture, not in terms of specific stories. Although some of the specific stories obviously inform the big picture, but that's what we're going to aim to do tonight. So tonight's session, 1 hour and a quarter, we'll see how we go. Overview the Gospel of Luke, look at the structure, think about the overall story, and think about what the story reveals or shows, not just what it says, but what it shows. But before we do that, I'd like to start with you. What has been your experience of reading the Gospel of Luke? Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good discussion. What I'm going to do now is share a whiteboard and get your feedback. And I won't be able to see who you are and who's speaking. So if you have something to say, unmute yourself, say your name, and say what you want to say, and I'll write it down. And this is the feedback and for us to learn from each other, because there's a lot of experience in this room, and there are a lot of things we can learn from each other. I know at least Trisha has sat down and read all of Luke through this past week and found it useful. I hope some others of you had the chance to do that. If not, I hope you do it after this session. That's my challenge for you. Sometime in the course of these 3 weeks to read all of Gospel of Luke through. Okay, so I'm ready for your feedback. What kind of things did you talk about in your breakout rooms? What did you notice? Anyone at all?
Wendy Darby from West Durham. We notice and we like the idea that Luke travels through, takes Jesus on a journey from the area around Galilee through Judea to Jerusalem. And that's how the stories all link in on his journey.
Yes. And you get to watch that journey in action, don't you?
Yes, yes.
And it kind of helps you to clock where he's going and what he's doing. Thank you very much. Other things you noticed or talked about?
Yeah, Ian Warburton, Tynedale, Northumberland. We talked about Luke's particular interest in those at the margins, and that would include women as well as men, because of him being a doctor, or perhaps because of.
Really bad connection.
Yes, thank you. And he really does. Luke famously has more stories about women and people on the margins than any of the other Gospels. There's clearly an interest in that group of people. Thank you. Well noticed.
Brian
There's
Simpson.
two of us. I'm Susan Thorne from Hampsterley. Two of us in my breakout group noticed how dark some of the teaching is, which I found unexpected because, as we've said, Luke focuses on the underdog, the women, and I'd expected him to be a bit of a pushover. In fact, he focuses on some fairly straight talking from Jesus.
Thank you, Susan. Can you give us an example of what you're thinking of as dark? I mean, I agree with you, but can you just give us an example so everyone else is on the same page as you?
Well, the rich man and Lazarus is difficult to swallow, I think.
Yep. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Brian Simpson from the Darlington and Teesdale circuit. We didn't get a great deal of time to go into it very deeply, but we did say that there wasn't any instructions. At least the four of us didn't have any instructions to do our homework in advance. Two things were mentioned: the favourite stories of the prodigal son, but particularly the Christmas narrative was something that a go-to account.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Some of the most famous stories in the Gospels are in Luke, and some of them are unique to Luke. The Good Samaritan is unique to Luke. The prodigal son is unique to Luke. Luke's particular version of the Christmas narrative is unique to Luke, and we do tend to go to Luke for those things. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, I'm not going to make you keep doing that, but I just wanted, okay, so clearly the message didn't get passed on to everyone, and I'm really sorry about that. I had asked for the message to be passed on to get you guys to all read through the Gospel of Luke, and really to read it as one big story, not to sit and tarry over details, but just to read it to get the big picture. Don't worry if you haven't got a chance to do that yet. You've still got 3 weeks to go, or another 2 weeks after this. So sometime in the next fortnight, just sit down and read the whole thing through. It really makes a big difference. You see things you will not otherwise see. You simply will. You'll see how the gospel works. And it doesn't take that long. Even a slow reader can do it in 2 hours. Most of us can do it in an hour and a half. So don't turn the telly on one evening, sit down and read Luke instead. That's my recommendation. It's transformative. You will actually see things, and you'll see how things fit together in a way that you hadn't understood before. And that happens to me every time. You suddenly, things jump out. So get the big picture, sit down and read it. Okay. I'm going back to screen share now. And we're going to talk, I'm going to give you some background to Luke as a gospel. So what is Luke? Of course, when you ask that question, what you're really asking is, what is the gospel? There's a lot of scholarly debate over this. Some scholars say it's historiography, it's a form of history. Some say it's ancient biography. This is where the scholarship is right now. It's ancient biography. And one famous scholar says it's a body of teaching. It's a way of presenting material to teach particular groups of people, in this case, the Christians. But all of them agree that Luke is a narrative. No matter where you get, no matter how you slice it, bottom line, Luke is a narrative. I'll come back to what I mean by that in a minute, but I'm just going to show you why we can say that. So Luke opens with what's called the Lucan prologue, the first 4 verses of Luke. Does someone want to read those to us? I hope you have your Bibles and Luke ready with you, because you're going to need them all evening. Someone want to read Luke 1:1-4 to us? Anybody jump in?
I can do that.
Thank you.
Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed.
Thank you, Christopher. This is called the Lucan prologue because it comes before the story starts. The story starts in verse 5. It introduces what the author believes the author is doing. And the word in verse 3, where it says orderly account, the word is actually the Greek word for narrative. It's an orderly narrative. That's what Luke says he's doing. I'm writing an orderly narrative so you can know what happened. But also, if you notice that, not just so you can know what happened, but you can know the truth about what you believe. So notice Luke comes with a purpose for you to know the truth about what you believe. And then notice verse 5, we get this prologue, and then the whole, the narrative, the story, if you want, starts and goes forward. And we can tell that clearly because in verse 5 it says, in the days of King Herod, so we've got a time marker there, a certain period of time when King Herod was alive, there was a priest named Zachariah, and you get a character marker. Here's the character we're looking at, and so on. So you get a clear demarcation of the story beginning. So you get here's what you get the author's prologue. Here's what I'm going to do in this story. And then you turn over verse 5 is chapter 1. Here we begin the story. So Luke, not only do scholars view Luke as a narrative, but Luke views Luke as a narrative. And that's what we're going to do in these 3 sessions, is how to use narrative reading, understanding Luke as a story to help us interpret it. So that raises the question, what's a narrative? Of course, a narrative, it can be defined as an account of interconnected events through time. Key things to draw attention to there, account, that's what Luke says anyway. Interconnected, that's the word I want you to notice. A narrative is not a hodgepodge of stories. Luke is not a biblical Aesop's fables. Luke is one big story. The stories are interconnected, they are events, and they give the sense of a passing of time. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what I want to say here is that the contents of Luke are presented to us as a narrative. They're in narrative form. That doesn't mean it's fiction. Lots of history is written in narrative form. Biographies are written in narrative form. This evening at your tea table, if someone asks you what you've been doing today, how did you answer that? Did you answer it in debate topics, or did you say, this morning I did this, and then I did that, and then I did this? That's a narrative. So we use it all the time to communicate things. narrative is about a particular form. It doesn't say you're fiction or you're a novel. Novels tend to be written in narrative form as well, but that's the overall genre is a narrative. Does that make sense? Okay. This is often referred to as a macro narrative. You don't need to know that term. The term I'm going to use is big picture. What we're going to talk about tonight is big picture, the overall narrative, the overall story of Luke. Those of you who end up reading something about Luke, you'll hear the term macro narrative. That means the overall story, the big story. So we're reading tonight for the big picture. And to read well for the big picture, there are a couple of things that it's important to do. One of these is to remember that all the different stories, so Luke's got lots of different stories in it. All the different stories, it's helpful to think of them, or might be helpful for you to think of them as jigsaw puzzle pieces. Each story is its own jigsaw puzzle piece, but they all connect together to make one big story. Each story has its own identity and its own internal coherence, but yet it's fitting together to make a big story. And so to read well, we need both. We need to look, it's like doing a jigsaw puzzle. It's pretty hard to do a jigsaw puzzle if you just have the pieces and you don't have the picture you're working towards. This is why I encourage you to read the whole of Luke and get that big picture in your head. You don't have to get lots of details, just a big picture. Otherwise, if you don't have the picture on the box and you have a red piece, what is it? If you don't know what the picture is. Is it a rose? Is it a fire engine? Is it a girl's dress? What's this red piece? I don't know. But if you have the picture, you can start to work out how that particular piece fits into the big picture. And reading Luke is just like that. Reading any narrative actually is just like that. This is how narrative works. There's a big picture and there are different elements within it that fit together. They each have their own integrity, but they contribute to the big picture too. Poor Susan Thorne is not coping with getting in. She keeps getting kicked out, I think. Okay. Luke's puzzle pieces, just to talk about Luke's particular puzzle pieces for a moment. The big picture, the micro narrative of Luke consists of what we call mini narratives, little stories in the big stories. So the feeding of the 5,000, the healing of the bleeding woman, the healing of Jairus's daughter, the healing of the paralyzed man. Those are all mini narratives, or what are often called micro narratives. The little mini stories, episodes. Parables, parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, the parable of the Pharisee and tax collectors in Luke. Those are also puzzle pieces, little puzzle pieces that fit together. And then there's lots of teaching in Luke, what you can call metaphoric and apocalyptic sayings. So the metaphors are the teaching, such as in chapter 6, when Jesus talks about well, I was going to say the parable of the house builder. That's not the right one. Let me find something in chapter 6 as a good example. Off the top of my head. So when Jesus talks about loving your enemies in chapter 6, those are often metaphoric sayings or teaching sayings. Apocalyptic sayings, chapter 17, for instance, is full of warnings about coming judgment. So you've got those kind of sayings as well. All of those are different puzzle pieces that fit together to tell one big story. The macro narrative, the big picture, is structured around encounters between Jesus and either individuals or groups. Even the teaching sections themselves are part of the story. They're not separate from the story. There's a well-known author, a well-known scholar named Loveday Alexander. You don't need to remember her name, but what you do need to know is that she compared Luke specifically to other forms of narrative writing and pointed out to some of the significant overlaps. And one of these is ancient teaching stories, which are written. So early teaching stories around the same time as the gospel are written around a teacher and the teacher's followers. And it's a story, but you get the teacher's teaching and understanding what the teacher's trying to communicate through the story. So the teaching is part of the story. It's not separate from the story. It's part of it. And that Jesus is doing the same. You also in this scholar point out that in folktale that there's a similarity between Luke and folk tales, because folk tales are about encounters with lots of different individuals. There's a central character who encounters lots of different individuals, and Luke feels like that sometimes. But most importantly, Luke is written very much like some of the Old Testament stories, Old Testament narrative. Luke primarily follows this particular model, a coherent, theologically interconnected account. So there's theology undergirding all of it. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. How does Luke arrange Luke's picture? So Luke arranges the picture as a temporal sequence, as a kind of one thing after another that happens. But I want to emphasize that the arrangement is first and foremost theological. Not tonight, but in the session next week, we're going to show, we're going to talk about how Luke arranges certain stories together to help them talk to each other and help us to understand them. And it's almost always a theological arrangement. There's a theology driving it. It appears, however, to be chronological. I don't think you should think it's chronological, but there is a sense of chronology in it because it begins very clearly with the infancy stories. The first 2 chapters of Luke are about the birth narratives of John the Baptist and Jesus, and it ends with Jesus' death and resurrection. So there is a sense of the passing of time, and you are certain places in Jesus' life and Jesus' ministry, and you need to take into account where you are in Jesus' life and ministry as you interpret and use the stories. One thing to really notice here in the infancy stories, the first 2 chapters, and the passion narratives, chapters 22, 23, and 24, so the last 3 chapters, the narrative slows down. The pace of the narrative slows right down, and you get lots of details filled in. That's significant. When the narrative slows down, when the pace slows down, and it starts to focus on lots of things, it's saying to you, this is an important section of this story, of this big picture. Okay. Well, I'm going to put you back in your breakout rooms in a minute. And what I want you to do is to think about Luke's big picture. You're going to need to use your Bibles. I don't want you to tarry over details. I just want you to flip through the 24 chapters and ask yourself, how would I outline this? What is the overall structure here? What are the main sections? Try to look for the big puzzle pieces. There are lots of little puzzle pieces. Look for the big puzzle pieces. The prologue is one. The 4 verses, I'll give you that one. Prologue is where you start. And then probably the infancy narratives. And you can go from there. Infancy narratives being chapters 1 and 2. The story of John the Baptist's birth and of Jesus's birth. Try to aim to divide the gospel into 4 to 8 sections. And there we all are. Welcome back, everyone. I know you didn't have long enough to do that. We could have taken the rest of the session doing that. You have my apologies. I want you to get started. Let's just do some shouting out here. So I've already set apart the prologue for you, verses chapter 1, 1 to 4. I should hasten to add, there's no real right and wrong here. Well, there are some rights and wrongs, but there's a lot of variation between the scholars. If you had 3 commentaries on Luke, almost the very first thing you see in any commentary is an outline of Luke. And if you compare 3, they'll all be different. There'll be some similarities, but there'll be some differences. So don't feel like, oh, I don't know if I got this right. Really don't think that way. Think, what kind of structure am I seeing? So after the prologue, what do we have next? Anyone?
I put infancy and adolescence.
Infancy and adolescence. Was that chapters 1 and 2, Mike?
1 to 4, actually.
1 to 4. Okay, you went right through John. You went through John the Baptist as well.
Yeah.
And 4 up to where?
Let me see.
Did you do all of chapter 4?
I just thought you wanted blocks. That's why
I did want blocks, and you're doing exactly the right thing. So infancy and the initiation of Jesus' mission, I think, is that what you're doing? Yeah, that sounds about right. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Anyone else from that early section?
We had a slightly shorter section that was the birth and infancy narratives that finish at the end of chapter 3, and then there's a distinct change because Jesus enters Galilee at that point.
Yes, so it's often divided 1 to 2 or 1, 2, 3, and then 4 as the beginning of Jesus' mission. We start to see Jesus' mission in Galilee. Yes, thank you, Christopher. Okay, what's next? What do we all do next?
Well, we had the Galilean ministry runs up to that point in 9:51, where Jesus sets his face towards Jerusalem.
Right, so you spotted what's often called the turning point in the narrative. Did anyone else spot that?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. So chapter 9, verse 51 is often considered the Lucan turning point, or the turning point in the narrative. Before that, we have Jesus straightforwardly in ministry, and His identity is being determined. Now, in fact, chapter 9 in general can be considered the turning point. Some people say 9:51 specifically, but also in chapter 9, we have Peter's confession of Jesus as Messiah, and Jesus says yes to that in his own way, of course. And then the transfiguration, so we then get revealed to us Jesus' identity. So we get Jesus' identity expressed through one of his disciples' mouths, and then we get Jesus' identity revealed in the transfiguration, and then we see Jesus set his face for Jerusalem. So there's a kind of turning point there where Jesus is then saying, okay, now we know who I am, I gotta go die. It's not quite like that, but you get the idea. So there is a turning point. Something about chapter 9 is a significant turning point in the narrative.
It's where Jesus gets his authority.
Yeah, he gets his authority, but he reveals his authority. I think revealing his authority would be a good way of thinking of that. And what do we have after chapter 9? What did everyone do?
Basically, we've got so up to chapter 19, where after chapter 19, it's all running up to the triumphal entry up to the crucifixion and ascension.
That's very good. So chapters kind of 9:51 up to chapter 19, we have Jesus moving towards Jerusalem, but he's zigzagging. He's not going directly there. It's all over the place. So there is a movement towards Jerusalem, but he's not there yet. And over and over and over, if you get the chance to read the gospel through, you'll see in that section, he repeatedly predicts his death. He knows it's coming. There's a build up to his death. And then we get to chapter 19, the triumphal entry. And then the last chapters up till 24 are Jesus' passion. Although the triumphal entry, 19 and 20 are their own thing. I'm going to show you. Well done, everybody, by the way. Very well done. I'm going to show you how one of my favorite scholars, well, frankly, my favorite Lucan scholar, I want to show you how he divides it. But as I said, it's done differently depending on who you look at. My favorite Lucan scholar, if you wanted to buy the best commentary as far as I'm concerned, Robert C. Tannehill, this is how he divides Luke up. I've simplified it a little bit. It's a little bit more complex in his commentary, but this is approximately how he does it. So 1 and 2, infancy narratives. 3 and 4, the initiation of Jesus' mission. 4 to 9, mission to Galilee, that's what you were talking about. 9 to 19, he calls it the expanded mission. A lot of commentators call it the journey to Jerusalem. It's really common to call 9 to 19 the journey to Jerusalem, because it's all about, we see Jesus doing a lot of things, and there's a lot of parables in that section, a lot of teaching through parables in particular, but we also over and over and over hear Jesus saying, I'm going to Jerusalem to die. Hey guys, I'm going to Jerusalem to die. Over and over he says it. Then in the temple, and then the rejection of the Messiah and the risen Jesus. And basically 19 to 24 can be configured a variety of ways, but we get the passion narrative. Yeah, everyone happy with that? If this kind of flummoxed you, go read all of Luke, and I think you'll see some of the major things about what's going on here. I'm going to move us on and talk about how narrative works a bit, how the big picture of the narrative works, particularly not any narrative. We're talking about the Gospel of Luke. Who's the central character? This narrative has a central character. This is not a trick question. Carol, I can see you saying Jesus. Yes. You're on mute, but I can see your mouth go, Jesus. Thank you, Carol. Central character is Jesus. What Luke does is give us a selective representation of Jesus' life. He doesn't tell us everything. You see other stories in other Gospels. And John, again, is very different. That's not his concern. His concern isn't to tell you everything. That is not what he's trying to do. He's not giving a general account of Jesus' life. He is trying to show you things and tell you things about Jesus to make some theological points about Jesus' identity. Narrative does two things, and this is all narratives. It's not just Luke, but Luke is certainly the case. Narrative both shows and tells. We'll do both of them. How narrative works is it shows you things and it tells you things. So there's a story at the center of Luke. The story it's telling is Jesus' mission. It's telling you the story of Jesus' mission, how Jesus is predicted, prophesied, comes, the mission he goes on, and how that mission gets fulfilled through his death, resurrection, and ascension. But narratives don't just tell you something, they also show you things. They show you things about characters in particular, or about how things work by pointing at them or revealing them, and not necessarily overtly talking about them or hinting at them. And we get a lot of that about Jesus' identity. What Luke is doing is revealing. This is why we refer to the Gospels as revelation, or revelation of Christ, because they are revealing Jesus' identity. This is a key function of the Gospel of Luke, is revelation of who Jesus is. I'm going to show you how this works by looking at two passages. We're going to look at these together. So we're going to do telling first. Luke tells us the story of Jesus' mission. Some of you have already pointed out chapter 4 is a turning point, and that's right. In chapter 4, Luke 4, verse 16 to 21, Jesus stands up in the synagogue and gives what he's often called his mission or his ministry manifesto, his statement of what he's come to do. It's his first public speech, and he clearly says, here's my mission, and this is what I'm going to be doing. Someone want to read for us? Which ones? Jesus stands up into the synagogue, unrolls the scroll, and reads. Can someone read verses 18 to 21? No, 18 to 24. So we'll just read that section. But look at it in your Bible as well. Someone reads it. Mike, you going to read it for us?
Yeah, I'll do that, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him.
Then he began to say, today has this been fulfilled in your hearing. Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. Okay, there are lots of things we could say about this passage. We're not going to do that. All I want you to notice is Jesus says, I'm fulfilling this passage. And then Luke goes on to show how Jesus fulfills the passage. So just really quickly look over the next couple of chapters and ask yourself, how are the things I see in this chapter fulfilling what Jesus says these next few chapters, fulfilling the things Jesus claims he's going to do. So the claims he makes in verses 18 and 19, he claims he's fulfilling these passages from Isaiah. What does he do to fulfill it? What do we see him doing? Anyone unmute and shout out things you see.
Healing.
He heals, exactly. He heals people, which is good news. It's also recovery of sight to the blind, the healing of people.
He teaches.
He teaches, so he brings good news, exactly.
And he calls the disciples.
He calls the disciples. He enables people to be his followers.
He annoys the leaders of the synagogue.
Yeah, he does annoy the leaders of the synagogue. We'll come back to that later. But yes, he does. We'll do that one next week, actually. Thank you, Mike.
He mixes with everybody.
He mixes with everybody.
Everybody.
Really important insight. He mixes with everybody. No one, the top dogs and the lowest. Everybody. He mixes with everybody. Good news is for everybody. Proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor, those who are interested, is the year of Jubilee. That was happened in the Old Testament, an Old Testament festival that was set up to help everything go back to ground zero. If you have been, your family been sold into slavery, you're no longer slaves. If you'd lost your land, you got your lands back. It was referred to as debts being forgiven. Debts were forgiven in the year of Jubilee, or the year of the Lord's favor. And Jesus is bringing the year of the Lord's favor when debts are forgiven. When everybody is forgiven, what's he ultimately going to do? He's going to die for the forgiveness of sins. So in fact, he is the ultimate year of Jubilee, as it were. Okay, we could go on and on about that, but and you could really, if you notice, setting the captives free, we see all kinds of exorcisms, for example, Jesus casting out demons. But you also have stories like the story of Zacchaeus, him being set free from his love of money and all these kinds of things. There's all kinds of ways that Jesus fulfills these things. So Jesus, we have in Luke, Jesus right up front saying, this is what I've come for, this is my mission, and we get to see Jesus fulfilling that mission. But there's more. Luke also shows us who Jesus is. Luke, turn to Luke 7 with me. Luke 7, verse 18 to 23. John the Baptist sends his disciples to Jesus to say, are you the Messiah or not? I mean, I can't work it out. John the Baptist's disciples say this to Jesus, are you the one to come or are we to wait for another? How does Jesus respond? Verse 21. Jesus was curing many people of diseases, plagues, and evil spirits, and had given sight to the blind. So he answered them, go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news brought to them. Blessed is anyone who takes no offense to me. This is a really important passage. It's telling us how to work out who Jesus is. What does Jesus say to do? Does Jesus just say, hey, I'm the Messiah? He doesn't. What does he do? What's he tell them to do?
Look at what I'm doing.
Look at what I'm doing. Look at me. You want to know who I am? You have to look at me. You have to look at me to understand what's going on. And that's exactly what the Gospel of Luke is doing. It's inviting us to look at Jesus. What does Jesus do? What does Jesus do? Jesus provides, Jesus has power over the creative order. Who has power over the created order? It can calm storms. God. Jesus has power over the demonic realm. Who's the Lord of all?
God.
God. Jesus can heal all sicknesses. Who gets to do that? And importantly, we see Jesus twice in this gospel raise people from the dead. Who gives life to people?
God.
God. Okay, so there's really, we are really seeing Jesus performing the functions of God. We see Jesus, but we have to look at him to understand who he is. The disciples of John the Baptist are told to look at him in order to see who he is, and we have to do that. To help us do that a little bit, I want us to look at the feeding of the 5,000. So turn to chapter 9, verses 11 to 15. We're doing the same thing here, the showing and telling. I want us to see it clearly through one smaller story. I'll give you a minute just to look at that on your own individually. Like for a moment, just look at it. I know you're familiar with it, but look at it. What's the story it's telling? What's the story we get? What story is Luke telling us? This is not a trick question, I promise.
Filling the hungry with good things.
Yes, he's filling the hungry with good things. He's feeding the hungry. Where are they? Setting is always important. We'll do this in session 3. Where are they?
Outside of Bethsaida.
Outside of Bethsaida, but into verse 12, they're in a deserted place. He's feeding. The disciples say, well, there's no place around here for us to get. There's no restaurants. There's no Starbucks. What are we going to do? And he's like, you feed them. So we see here a miracle story, Jesus feeding the crowd in the wilderness. What does it show us about Jesus? This is where you need to know your Old Testament. I said earlier that Luke is rooted in the Old Testament. It really is. If you know a little bit about the Old Testament, then what's showing about Jesus becomes clear pretty quickly.
Vision of manna in the wilderness.
Yes, exactly. Who feeds God's
God
people
feeding
in
his
the
people.
wilderness? Who? God feeds God's people man in the wilderness. What's Jesus doing?
Feeding the people.
Yeah, he's performing the work of God. What does God do in the Old Testament? God feeds his people in the wilderness. Jesus is doing the same thing. If you have any knowledge of the Old Testament at all, the connection is really clear. Wait a minute. Who is this person who feeds people in the Old Testament? Who feeds people in the wilderness? It's God. Yes, Jesus is performing the actions of feeding people in the wilderness out of compassion. But Luke's included this story because it also helps us to know Jesus' identity, who Jesus is. Let's do another one. The healing of the paralyzed man. So I'm going to make you skip all over the place here a little bit. Luke 5. This is an important story because it's the story. It's the first story in which Jesus comes in conflict with the authorities. That conflict goes on and on and on, and it builds and builds and builds in the gospel until they put him to death. We're going to talk about that next week. But this is a really important story for that reason. I want you to read it. Yes, take a moment just to read it, and then we're going to talk about it. So read the healing of the paralyzed man. Okay, what's the story that's being told? This is not a trick question. So we're doing the telling and the showing again. So we'll just do the telling. What story is being told? Important part of Jesus' mission.
Forgiveness of sins.
Yes, it's the story of the forgiveness of sins and healing. Yes. So we see, and it's actually quite a comical story. You've got these 4 friends who can't get through the crowd, and they climb up on the roof and they tear apart the roof, and they lower this paralyzed man down in front of Jesus, despite the crowd and despite the religious leaders. So there's a bit of comedy going on too. It's really attention getting, this story, because it's so unusual. And it really draws our focus in on what Jesus is going to do with this man. And Jesus forgives sins and he heals them. So what's the connection that Jesus makes in verses 23 to 24?
Showing
What is, go ahead. Sorry? Was that Carol?
He has the authority to forgive sins.
He has
that by healing the man.
He has authority to do both. He has authority to forgive sins, and he has the authority. He's connecting healing with forgiveness of sins. There's a connection being drawn between those two. I can do both, and I have authority to do both. Of course, the religious leaders are question that. Verse 21. The scribes and the Pharisees began to question, who is this who is speaking blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God? So what is the story showing us?
Jesus.
That Jesus has the authority of God. Jesus is forgiving sins. And the scribes and the Pharisees know.
They think he's a blasphemer because they haven't got the gist of who he is. We would think the same thing if someone started to do the same thing today.
We would. You're quite right, Dorothy. We really would. We would. You can't do that. Only God can do that. Who has the authority to forgive sins? Only God can do that. Jesus does an amazing thing here. What's really interesting about this story is it is raising the question of Jesus' identity right from basically the beginning, virtually the beginning of the gospel. Now, we already know, this is really interesting because of how narrative works. We already know who Jesus is. When do we find out who Jesus is? As a reader, when you're reading the story, when do you find out who Jesus is?
Chapter 9, verse 51.
Well, no, chapter 9, verse 51 is when he goes to Jerusalem, but earlier, right at the beginning of the narrative, when do we find out who Jesus is?
From the Baptist, when he's baptized.
Even before that, Mike, you're almost there. Go backwards further.
The Annunciation.
The Annunciation. We're told, the reader is told from the beginning who Jesus is. We know who Jesus is. We know his identity. He's the son of David. He's the Messiah. He's the Savior. And then we get that confirmed with Elizabeth. We get it confirmed with the Magnificat. We get that confirmed with Simeon in the temple. So the infancy narratives tell us who Jesus is. And then we spend the next part of the gospel watching everyone else work it out. We watch them stumbling over it and trying to work out who he is. And Jesus revealing it over and over again, but not speaking it. And the speaking comes from, of course, Peter in chapter 9. But there is this wrestling, particularly in the first half of the gospel up to chapter 9, wrestling with Jesus' identity. Who is this man? Who is this man who can forgive sins?
It always seems puzzling that John doesn't know.
Yeah, John is kind of losing heart, isn't he? But if you go back to chapter 3, what does John expected? John expected judgment and fire. And Jesus wasn't doing that. The judgment of fire come, but that's later, Jesus warns. You're right. You're quite right. But John the Baptist is losing a bit of heart. He was in jail after all in chapter 7. And he does get beheaded very soon after that. So he was having a bit of a hard time.
I think it takes us, if Jesus, supposing Jesus hadn't happened and he came today, it does take us a little while for it to, you've got to maturely ask, who is this man? The process is a natural process before they could actually decide, yes, this is the Messiah. Yeah, we would do the same.
And I think Jesus knew that people needed time to work out who he was and to actually, what he does with John the Baptist's disciples is so important. He says, you have to look at me. Me telling you isn't going to make you believe. You've got to see it in action. And so we see in Luke, Jesus showing us in action. We see Jesus revealing over and over who he is, as well as fulfilling God's mission. I was going to get us to talk about themes at the end. And anything you want to ask or say at this point, we can either use the time. We can use the time in almost. Oh, we've got 3 minutes. Okay. Let's just take questions or comments. Let's do that. That's probably the best use of the 3 minutes. Questions, comments, insights, thoughts, reflections.
Just a comment, seeing verse 26 of chapter 5, that they actually understood who Jesus was because amazement seized them all and they glorified God. Yeah.
Yeah. So at that point, even the religious leaders and the religious leaders, scribes and Pharisees turn and hold it. They're amazed. That doesn't happen. It basically doesn't happen again. That's the only time it happens.
Can I say that I like the idea of splitting the gospel into sections and realizing very quickly that other people's Bible commentaries had slightly different interpretations on the sections.
Yeah.
And that tonight was a revelation. So thank you.
You're welcome, Brian. Look at different commentaries. Just open them up and look and see how they've divided it. And of course, commentaries are often driven by particular theological agendas, and that will all sometimes influence their divisions.
I wondered who Luke thought he was writing this orderly account for.
Well, that's a big debate. So it says at the beginning in the prologue to Theophilus. The name Theophilus means friend of God. So Theophilus may have been a real person who was a friend of God, someone perhaps like Luke, a Gentile who was a God-fearer. But of course, many scholars think it's actually a pseudonym for anyone who is a friend of God. For you, it's for you and me. It's for anyone who wants to know more about their faith. So there are different ways of interpreting Theophilus. Peter Jackson's coming in. I'm assuming that's not the person who wrote Lord of the Rings, or not wrote, but wrote the films. There must be another Peter Jackson. I'll be delighted if that's who it is, but other questions or thoughts, reflections, things you've seen tonight? I mean, anything, insight you've had will help others, so that's worth sharing. Or reflections you've had that will help others.
What came to me when I was looking through was that the Galilee stuff, the thing was all about faith. A lot of them was about faith in God. And
yes, there's emphasis on faith. If we would have done the last thing I was going to do was themes we've noticed, and that's a big theme in Luke, and is a big emphasis in the Galilean section, having faith. Thank you, Carol.
I looked at it seemed as if the emphasis was on cost.
On who?
Cost.
Cost.
Discipleship.
Yeah, and that gets picked up strongly in chapter 9. It's a really big theme in chapter 9. I'm going to the cross to die. You're going to follow me, and then you get the three different people who want to follow Jesus, and he challenges them. The cost of discipleship becomes a big theme, and discipleship itself becomes a big theme, kind of from chapter 9 onwards.
What I noticed, Melody, is tonight we've got 42 computers, but there's like 42 different understandings of the same passages, where, you know, this is only a small portion of congregation of the Christian church, and you can see why people get confused. So many opinions.
Yeah, and there are always so many opinions. The reasons of this, we call this the hermeneutical spiral, the hermeneutical dialogue. So each of us has a place we start from, and we come to Luke with a particular starting point. Each of us has our own situation, and we bring that to the story. And so what we do when we come to the story of Luke is we enter into a dialogue, we enter into a conversation with it. We bring ourselves to it, so we will see it differently. But Luke has things to say as well. And what I want us to do in these 3 sessions is hear what Luke has to say. And if that's the case, then it's like us all going into a lecture theater or all going into a film or whatever, and also having that story told to us and listening and saying, well, I got this out of it, I got that out of it, but yet there will be some coherence because it is still the same story. Does that make sense? So think of yourself as being in a conversation partner with the gospel. You have things to bring to it. The congregations you work with will have things to bring to it that are part of that conversation. But yet, if you're doing this well, you need to keep going back to the text, we say, go back to what the story itself says, and try to listen to what it says so that you are actually in a conversation rather than you doing all the talking. When you do all the talking, then you don't hear. Okay, I think that's our time. Anyone want to say any last thing or any last question? What we're going to do next week is we're going to look at some more specific stories next week, and we're going to think about how Luke guides us through the story, what the story looks like, but looking at specific ways that Luke communicates, how Luke arranges stories together in order to make an impact on you, and that kind of thing. I'm going to continue on with the jigsaw puzzle pieces and the big picture, but I'm going to assume a little bit more knowledge of the big picture and look at more specific jigsaw puzzle pieces, if that helps.